In March 2024, Detective Ryan Walsh was tasked with clearing out the Chicago Police Department's oldest evidence storage facility, a basement archive that hadn't been properly cataloged since the 1960s. Among boxes of forgotten case files and deteriorating evidence from decades past, Walsh discovered a collection marked Unsolved, 1890 to 1895, Cook County Sheriff's Department. The box contained the remnants of various cold cases from Chicago's tumultuous late 19th century, when the city was experiencing rapid industrial growth alongside rampant corruption and violence. Most items were predictable: rusted weapons, faded witness statements, and deteriorated personal effects from long-dead victims and suspects. However, one item immediately caught Walsh's attention: a pristine photograph preserved between sheets of waxed paper. The image showed 5 well-dressed men standing outside what appeared to be a Chicago warehouse or industrial building. Their formal attire, dark wool suits, bowler hats, and gold watch chains, suggested men of considerable wealth and social standing during America's Gilded Age. A handwritten label on the photograph's backing read, "Suspects, Morrison Warehouse Incident, October 1890, Case to 1890-347, Unsolved." Below that, in different handwriting, evidence photographed before questioning. Note discrepancies in witness statements regarding individual possessions. The photograph bore the stamp of Kellerman Studios, Chicago, Illinois, a photography business that had operated in the city's downtown district during the 1890s. What made this particular image significant wasn't just its connection to an unsolved case, but what Detective Walsh noticed when he examined it under magnification. The man standing third from left, identified in accompanying documents as businessman Thomas Whitmore, appeared to be concealing something in his left hand, something that the original investigators had somehow overlooked, but which might finally provide answers to a 134-year-old mystery that had left 5 men dead in justice, unserved. Walsh felt the familiar tingle of curiosity that had driven his 20-year career in law enforcement. Cold cases held a special fascination for him, particularly those where evidence had been preserved well enough to benefit from modern investigative techniques. This photograph, with its hidden detail and connection to unsolved murders, promised to be one of the most intriguing puzzles he'd ever encountered. The Morrison Warehouse incident was about to be reopened, and Detective Walsh had no idea that his discovery would ultimately expose one of the most shocking criminal conspiracies in Chicago's violent history. Detective Walsh examined the 1890 photograph under the evidence room's high-powered magnifying equipment, focusing on Thomas Whitmore's suspicious hand positioning, while his 4 companions stood with their hands clearly visible, clasped behind backs, holding hats or resting on walking canes. Whitmore's left hand was partially hidden within his coat, his fingers wrapped around something small and metallic. Under magnification, the concealed object became more distinct. It appeared to be cylindrical, roughly the length of a fountain pen but thicker, with what looked like intricate engravings along its surface. Most tellingly, a thin chain was visible connecting the object to Whitmore's vest pocket, suggesting it was valuable enough to secure, yet important enough to keep immediately accessible. Walsh pulled the case file associated with the photograph. The Morrison Warehouse incident of October 1890 had been one of Chicago's most puzzling crimes. 5 prominent businessmen had been found dead inside the warehouse, apparently victims of robbery gone wrong. However, the case had never been solved because of contradictory evidence and witness statements that never quite aligned. The original investigation notes revealed that Thomas Whitmore had been the primary suspect. Witnesses claimed to have seen him arguing with the other 4 men on the day of their deaths. More damning, Whitmore had fled Chicago immediately after the bodies were discovered, disappearing completely despite a citywide manhunt. What puzzled the 1890 investigators was that nothing appeared to have been stolen from the warehouse or the victims. All 5 men still wore their expensive jewelry and carried their wallets when found, yet something had clearly motivated the violence, and Whitmore's sudden disappearance suggested guilt. The photograph had been taken just days before the murders, during what police records described as a business meeting at the warehouse. It was meant to document the last known gathering of all 5 men together. Detective Walsh studied the faces in the photograph, looking for clues about the relationships between these men. 4 of them appeared relaxed, even friendly. But Whitmore's expression was notably tense, his jaw clenched, his eyes focused somewhere beyond the camera. Combined with his concealed grip on the mysterious object, his body language suggested a man under extreme pressure. Now, 134 years later, Walsh realized that the object in Whitmore's hand might hold the key to understanding what had really happened at Morrison Warehouse, and perhaps finally bring justice to a case that had baffled Chicago's finest detectives for over a century. Detective Walsh brought the cold case to his supervisor, Captain Maria Rodriguez, who had built her reputation on solving decades-old crimes using modern forensic techniques. Rodriguez examined the photograph and case files with the methodical attention that had earned her department-wide respect. 5 prominent businessmen murdered in 1890, Primary suspect vanishes without a trace. And no apparent motive, Rodriguez summarized. What's your theory about this hidden object? Walsh had spent hours studying the magnified image. It's definitely metallic, probably silver or platinum given the reflection pattern. The engravings suggest it wasn't mass-produced. This was custom work, expensive custom work. And look at how he's holding it. Rodriguez peered through the magnifying glass. He's gripping it like his life depends on it. Not casual possession, desperate possession. They decided to consult Dr. Emily Chen, a forensic photographer who specialized in enhancing historical images. Using digital restoration techniques unavailable to 1890s investigators, Chen was able to reveal details that had been hidden in shadow and grain for 134 years. The enhanced image showed that Whitmore's concealed object was actually a small cylindrical container, ornately decorated with what appeared to be family or business crests. More importantly, the container's cap was slightly unscrewed, suggesting it had been recently opened or was being prepared for opening. This isn't jewelry or a personal trinket, Chen observed. The size, shape, and his handling suggest it's designed to hold something, documents maybe, or small valuable items. Walsh began researching the 5 men in the photograph. Thomas Whitmore had been a successful grain merchant with business interests throughout the Midwest. His 4 companions were equally prominent. Railroad investor James Morrison, who owned the warehouse where they died, banker William Hartley, steel manufacturer Robert Kane, and shipping magnate Charles Brennan. What connected these 5 men, beyond their deaths, was their involvement in Chicago's rapid industrial expansion during the 1880s. All had profited enormously from government contracts, land deals, and municipal construction projects that had transformed Chicago from a frontier town into America's second largest city. The more Walsh learned about their business relationships, the more he suspected that the object in Whitmore's hand contained evidence of corruption that might have motivated murder. In 1890s Chicago, fortunes were made and lost through political connections, and men had been killed for far less than what these 5 had accumulated. The investigation was about to reveal that the Morrison warehouse murders were not random violence, but the climax of a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of Chicago's political and business establishment. Walsh's research into the 5 businessmen revealed a web of corruption that dominated Chicago's politics and economy in the 1890s. Working with the Chicago Historical Society, he uncovered records showing that all 5 men had been involved in a massive fraud scheme involving city construction contracts worth millions in today's currency. The scheme was elegant in its simplicity. The 5 men would bid on municipal projects through shell companies, artificially inflating costs and splitting the excess profits with corrupt city officials. Between 1887 and 1890, they had secured contracts for everything from street paving to bridge construction, consistently delivering substandard work at premium prices. Historical records showed that by October 1890, a reform movement was gaining momentum in Chicago politics. A crusading journalist named Margaret Sullivan had been investigating municipal corruption and was reportedly close to exposing the entire network. More troubling for the 5 conspirators, City Auditor Daniel Murphy had begun scrutinizing their contracts and questioning the consistently high costs and poor quality of their work. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a historian specializing in Chicago's Gilded Age politics, helped Walsh understand the stakes involved. These men weren't just stealing money, she explained. They were undermining the city's entire infrastructure. Bridges that should have lasted decades were collapsing within years. Streets were crumbling because they used inferior materials while charging for premium supplies. Walsh discovered that Thomas Whitmore had served as the group's record keeper, maintaining detailed documentation of bribes paid, contracts manipulated, and profits distributed. This role would explain why he possessed evidence that could destroy all 5 men, and why the others might have decided he had become a liability. The investigation took a dramatic turn when Walsh found Margaret Sullivan's archived notes at the Chicago Tribune's historical collection. Her final article, published just days before the Morrison warehouse murders, had promised explosive revelations about corruption in city government that will shock Chicago residents and lead to criminal prosecutions. However, Sullivan's follow-up articles were never published. According to newspaper records, she had abruptly left Chicago in late October 1890, citing personal reasons. Her departure coincided exactly with the warehouse murders. Walsh began to suspect that Thomas Whitmore hadn't been the perpetrator of the Morrison warehouse murders. He had been another victim. The cylindrical container in his left hand likely contained evidence that could have exposed the entire corruption network, making him a target rather than a killer. The case was becoming more complex, but Walsh was convinced that the truth lay hidden within that small metallic object that Whitmore had clutched so desperately in what may have been the last photograph ever taken of him alive. Walsh's investigation took a crucial turn when he located Margaret Sullivan's descendants in Chicago. Her great-granddaughter, Rebecca Sullivan Parker, had inherited not only family documents, but also stories passed down through generations about the journalist's abrupt departure. from the city in 1890, family. Legend always said that Grandma Margaret had uncovered something so dangerous that she had to flee Chicago to save her life. Rebecca explained during their meeting. She lived the rest of her life in San Francisco, but she never talked about her Chicago years, even to her children. Rebecca provided Walsh with a trunk of Margaret Sullivan's personal papers that had been stored in her family's attic for decades. Among the documents was Sullivan's unpublished manuscript about Chicago corruption, titled The City That Greed Built. The manuscript revealed the full scope of the conspiracy involving Whitmore and his associates. According to Sullivan's research, Thomas Whitmore had approached her in September 1890, claiming to possess definitive proof of the corruption scheme. He had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the group's activities, particularly after a bridge collapse killed 3 workers due to substandard materials. Sullivan wrote, Mr. Whitmore appeared genuinely remorseful and fearful. He spoke of evidence that could hang them all, documentary proof of every bribe, every fraudulent contract, every life lost to their greed. The manuscript revealed that Whitmore had been collecting evidence for months, secretly documenting the group's activities in anticipation of eventually exposing the conspiracy. He had grown particularly disturbed by their indifference to public safety, especially after several infrastructure failures had resulted in injuries and deaths. Most significantly, Sullivan's notes described the evidence Whitmore possessed: a sealed cylinder containing photographs of forged documents, copies of bribery receipts, and a detailed ledger showing the true costs versus reported costs of city projects. Mr. Whitmore claimed this evidence was sufficient to secure criminal convictions for all involved parties, including several prominent city officials. Walsh realized that the cylindrical object in Whitmore's left hand in the 1890 photograph was this crucial evidence container. Whitmore hadn't been hiding criminal evidence. He had been protecting evidence of crimes committed by his associates. Sullivan's manuscript also revealed why she had fled Chicago. I received word that Mr. Whitmore's associates had discovered his intention to cooperate with my investigation. Fearing for both our lives, I urged him to leave the city immediately. He refused, insisting that he owed it to the victims of their negligence to see justice done. The final entry in Sullivan's notes was chilling. October 15th, 1890. Mr. Whitmore failed to appear for our scheduled meeting. I fear the worst has occurred. Armed with Margaret Sullivan's manuscript, Walsh began reconstructing the final days before the Morrison warehouse murders. The evidence suggested that Whitmore's 4 associates had discovered his plan to expose their corruption scheme and had lured him to the warehouse under false pretenses. Walsh consulted with Dr. Robert Kim, a criminal psychologist who specialized in historical cases involving business conspiracies. Kim's analysis of the available evidence painted a picture of a carefully orchestrated plan to eliminate Whitmore while making his death appear to be part of a random robbery. 4 experienced criminals wouldn't meet their target in an isolated location unless they were confident of controlling the situation, Kim explained. The fact that all 5 men died suggests that something went wrong with their plan. Possibly Whitmore was more prepared for trouble than they anticipated. Walsh discovered that James Morrison, the warehouse owner, had been the likely architect of the murder plot. Morrison had access to the building and could arrange a meeting without arousing suspicion. Bank records from 1890 showed that Morrison had withdrawn a large sum of cash in the days before the murders, possibly to hire additional help for the operation. The investigation revealed that Morrison had connections to Chicago's criminal underworld through his shipping business. Several of his dock workers had criminal records, and he had previously been suspected of using his warehouses to store stolen goods, though nothing had been proven. Walsh theorized that Morrison had arranged for Whitmore to meet at the warehouse, ostensibly for a business discussion, while actually planning to kill him and recover the incriminating evidence. The presence of the other 3 conspirators suggested they wanted to personally ensure Whitmore's silence and witness the destruction of the evidence that could destroy them all. However, the fact that all 5 men had died indicated that Whitmore had either anticipated the trap or had brought protection of his own. The original police reports mentioned that the warehouse showed signs of a fierce struggle, with overturned furniture and bullet holes in the walls, suggesting a prolonged fight rather than a simple execution. Most intriguingly, the 1890 investigators had noted that the warehouse's safe had been found open and empty, though no one knew what it might have contained. Walsh suspected that Whitmore might have hidden backup copies of his evidence in Morrison's own safe, a final act of defiance that could explain why the confrontation had turned so violent. The photograph now represented the last moment when Thomas Whitmore held the evidence that could have exposed Chicago's most powerful men, evidence he would die protecting just days later. Walsh's research into the warehouse murders led him to examine the original crime scene reports with modern forensic understanding. The 1890 investigators had documented the scene meticulously, but lacked the scientific knowledge to interpret many of the physical clues that could now reveal the truth about that final confrontation. The original autopsy reports preserved in Cook County's medical archives, showed that all 5 men had died from gunshot wounds. But the pattern of injuries told a complex story. Thomas Whitmore had been shot 3 times, twice in the chest and once in the head, suggesting he had been the primary target. The other 4 men had each sustained single gunshot wounds, indicating they might not have been the intended victims. Dr. Lisa Chen, a forensic pathologist, reviewed the autopsy findings with Walsh. The wound patterns suggest Whitmore was armed and fought back, she observed. The positioning of the other victims indicates they were caught in crossfire rather than executed. This looks like a planned murder that became a chaotic gunfight. Walsh discovered that the warehouse had been rented specifically for the October meeting, with Morrison paying for exclusive use of the building for that evening. Rental agreements showed that Morrison had requested all dock workers be dismissed early that day, ensuring complete privacy for whatever was planned. The investigation revealed that Whitmore had suspected the danger he faced. According to Margaret Sullivan's notes, he had hired a bodyguard in the weeks before the meeting, a former Pinkerton detective named Patrick O'Malley. Hotel records showed that O'Malley had been staying in Chicago during October 1890, but had left the city immediately after the warehouse incident. Walsh theorized that O'Malley had accompanied Whitmore to the warehouse meeting, possibly hidden nearby as backup protection. When the confrontation turned violent, O'Malley had likely intervened, resulting in the unexpected deaths of Morrison and his 3 associates. The original police reports noted that 6 sets of footprints had been found in the warehouse, though only 5 bodies were recovered. The 6th person had apparently escaped through a rear exit, consistent with Walsh's theory about the bodyguard's involvement. Most importantly, the evidence cylinder that Whitmore had clutched in the photograph was nowhere to be found at the crime scene. The 1890 investigators had assumed it was lost in the chaos or possibly taken by the unknown 6th person, but Walsh suspected that Whitmore had successfully hidden the evidence before the confrontation began. The photograph now represented more than just concealed evidence. It captured the last moment when Thomas Whitmore held proof of corruption that he would soon die trying to protect, evidence that might still be hidden somewhere in Chicago, waiting to finally deliver the justice he had died seeking. Walsh's investigation led him to examine property records for buildings that Thomas Whitmore had owned or frequented in 1890 Chicago. If Whitmore had hidden backup evidence before the fatal warehouse meeting, he would have chosen a location that was both secure and accessible to someone he trusted. The search revealed that Whitmore owned a modest office building on LaSalle Street, which he had used as headquarters for his grain trading business. The building still existed, though it had been converted to apartments decades earlier. Walsh obtained permission from the current owners to examine the basement and structural areas that might have contained hidden compartments. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, an architectural historian, assisted in the search using ground-penetrating radar and thermal imaging equipment that could detect hidden cavities in the building's walls. The scan revealed an anomaly in the basement wall, a space approximately 18 inches square that appeared to be artificially created. Careful. Excavation of the wall revealed a hidden compartment containing a waterproof metal box, similar in design to the cylinder Whitmore had held in the photograph. The box bore the same ornate engravings that were visible in the enhanced image, confirming that this was indeed Whitmore's backup evidence cache. Inside the box, preserved after 134 years, was exactly what Margaret Sullivan had described in her manuscript. Photographs of forged city documents, copies of receipts for bribes paid to city officials, and a detailed ledger showing the true costs of construction projects versus the amounts charged to the city. The ledger was particularly damning, documenting how the 5 conspirators had systematically overcharged Chicago taxpayers by an estimated $2.3 million, or equivalent to over $80 million today, while delivering substandard infrastructure that had resulted in multiple bridge collapses, street failures, and building problems. Most shocking was a list of city officials who had received regular payments in exchange for approving fraudulent contracts. The corruption network included aldermen, building inspectors, the city treasurer, and even members of the mayor's staff. Detective Walsh also found personal letters from Whitmore to his wife, written in the weeks before his death, expressing his guilt over the lives lost due to their group's negligence and his determination to expose the truth regardless of personal consequences. One letter read, "My dear Catherine, I can no longer remain silent about the suffering we have caused through our greed. The families of those killed by our shoddy work deserve justice, and I intend to provide it, whatever the cost to myself." The evidence box also contained a sealed letter addressed to Margaret Sullivan, apparently written just before the warehouse meeting. In it, Whitmore provided the location of his evidence cache and urged Sullivan to ensure its contents reached honest authorities if anything happened to him. After 134 years, Thomas Whitmore's evidence had finally been recovered, vindicating his attempt to expose the corruption that had ultimately cost him his life. The discovery of Whitmore's hidden evidence sent shockwaves through Chicago's historical and legal communities. The documentation proved conclusively that the Morrison warehouse murders had not been a robbery gone wrong, but the violent climax of a corruption scandal that had robbed Chicago taxpayers of millions of dollars and cost numerous lives through infrastructure failures. Detective Walsh worked with the Chicago Historical Commission and Cook County District Attorney's Office to analyze the implications of the 134-year-old evidence. While criminal prosecution was obviously impossible, the documentation demanded a complete reassessment of one of Chicago's most infamous unsolved cases. Dr. Margaret Foster, a leading authority on Chicago history, helped contextualize the evidence within the broader pattern of Gilded Age corruption. And what Whitmore documented wasn't unusual for the era, she explained, but the scale of the fraud and the body count that resulted from their negligence was extraordinary, even by 1890 standards. The evidence revealed that the infrastructure failures attributed to the conspiracy had been far more extensive than previously known. Between 1887 and 1890, substandard materials and shoddy construction had resulted in 3 bridge collapses, multiple building failures, and street cave-ins that had killed 17 people and injured dozens more. Walsh's investigation also vindicated Margaret Sullivan's reporting. Her descendants were finally able to understand why their ancestor had fled Chicago and never returned. The evidence confirmed that her life had indeed been in danger, and that her decision to leave the city had likely saved her life. The case gained national media attention when major newspapers picked up the story of the century-old evidence cache. The Washington Post headline read, "Chicago detective solves 1890 murder case using evidence, hidden for 134 years." The New York Times called it one of the most remarkable cold case breakthroughs in American law enforcement history. Most importantly for the families involved, the truth about Thomas Whitmore's character was finally revealed. For 134 years, he had been remembered as the primary suspect in 5 brutal murders. Now, the evidence proved that he had been a whistleblower who died trying to expose corruption and seek justice for the victims of his former associate's greed. Whitmore's great-great-granddaughter, Patricia Whitmore Johnson, attended a ceremony where Detective Walsh presented the family with the evidence box and a formal statement from the Chicago Police Department, clearing Thomas Whitmore of any wrongdoing in the warehouse. "Murders. Our family always believed that great-great-grandfather Thomas was innocent," Patricia said. "But we never imagined he was actually a hero who died trying to protect others." The photograph that had started the investigation was now understood in its proper context. It showed a man preparing to risk everything to expose the truth. 6. Months after the discovery of Whitmore's evidence, the impact of the solved case continued to resonate throughout Chicago and beyond. The story had become more than just a historical curiosity. It had evolved into a powerful reminder about the importance of courage. In exposing corruption and the long reach of justice, the Chicago Police Department created a permanent exhibit featuring the 1890 photograph, Whitmore's evidence cache, and the story of how modern investigative techniques had solved a 134-year-old case. The display became one of the most popular attractions in the department's public tour program, inspiring visitors with the tale of persistence and ultimate vindication. Detective Walsh received commendations from both the Chicago Police Department and the International Association of Cold Case investigators for his groundbreaking work. His methods, combining traditional police work with historical research and modern forensic techniques, became a model for other departments dealing with century-old unsolved cases. The Whitmore Foundation, established by Thomas Whitmore's descendants, began awarding annual scholarships to journalism students and grants to investigators working on cold cases involving corruption. The Foundation's mission statement read, "Ensuring that those who risk everything to expose the truth are remembered, and that justice, however delayed, is never abandoned." Margaret Sullivan was posthumously honored by the Chicago Press Club for her courage in investigating municipal corruption despite personal danger. Her unpublished manuscript was finally released, providing historians with valuable insights into Chicago's turbulent political climate during the 1890s. The Morrison warehouse, which had been scheduled for demolition, was instead converted into a museum dedicated to Chicago's Gilded Age history. The building's basement, where the final confrontation had occurred, was preserved exactly as it had been found, serving as a somber reminder of the cost of both corruption and the courage to oppose it. Most significantly, Thomas Whitmore's story influenced contemporary discussions about whistleblower protection and corporate responsibility. His example of someone willing to risk everything to expose wrongdoing resonated with modern audiences facing similar ethical dilemmas. The original 1890 photograph, which had seemed to show 5 successful businessmen, was now properly understood as capturing the final moment before a confrontation between corruption and conscience that would define Chicago history. Patricia Whitmore Johnson reflected on her family's transformation from shame to pride. For 134 years, we carried the burden of believing our ancestor was a murderer, Now we know he was actually a hero who died protecting others. Detective Walsh didn't just solve a cold case, he gave us back our family's honor. The photograph that had revealed its secret after more than a century served as lasting proof that truth, however long buried, eventually finds its way to light.